Today, it's great to be joined by Democratic Congressman Adam Schiff, who is a progressive leader in Congress representing California's 30th district. He is running for Senate, hoping to build an economy that works for everyone and safeguard our democracy, protect the planet, things which really should not be controversial at this point in time, Congressman. Great to have you on. Listen, let me start with what I know is on the forefront of many of my viewers' minds, which is anybody getting indicted at any point? You know, we've been going through this thing for years, and we've been talking about the former president and associates and others. Where are you on this issue at this point of what you expect to see?
Yeah, I have been fairly conservative in my expectations, maybe because I don't want to get my hopes up, but also because the Justice Department has been so slow to move for so long. They moved with alacrity when it came to the people breaking into the Capitol on January 6th and assaulting police officers, but it took them a very long time to investigate the multiple lines of effort to overturn the election. The president's call with the Georgia Secretary of State, for example, but also his role in the incitement of that attack, the higher ups in that plot that culminated on January 6th. We were way out ahead of them in the investigation, which is very unusual for Congress, as cumbersome as it is to be ahead of the Justice Department.
Yeah.
I do think the appointment of a special counsel was a positive sign because he seems to be, not cautious like the Attorney General and leaning into that investigation finally. I also am very impressed with what we see out of Fulton County, Georgia. In many respects, I'm more optimistic about the prosecutor in Fulton County than I am about the Justice Department. But I think prudently, we should expect that there's no prosecutor who will rescue the country from this danger that we may just very well have to defeat it at the polls again. But I will be happily proven wrong by either prosecutor or the Manhattan DA, which I think is probably the least likely candidate to move forward, but nonetheless, more exposure of the president.
So over the weekend at a particularly deranged edition of CPAC, Donald Trump held sort of like an impromptu press conference and was asked some version of the question, if you are indicted, however many times, will that interfere with your presidential run? And he said no. And the entire atmosphere at CPAC, I don't know how much you saw, but one of the trends is that the biggest applause lines are either homophobic or more recently transphobic stuff. This really seems to get the modern right excited. Maybe part of it is because there's a sort of lack of policy outside of this sort of rhetoric. How concerned are you about the degree to which the transgender community now seems to be the primary target of the MAGA movement?
I'm deeply concerned about it. I'm a vice chair of the Equality Caucus, so this is an issue I've been very focused on behalf of my constituents. And you're right. Just a couple of weeks ago, Donald Trump did a video from Mar-a-Lago, the whole purpose of which was to demonize the trans community, basically to, I guess, show his GOP Trump MAGA base that he's even worse on those issues than Ron DeSantis. And this is the kind of primary that's going on in the GOP, which is who can most dehumanize one of the most vulnerable populations in the country, one that has a very high, tragically very high suicide rate, as well as being the victim of a lot of violence directed at the community by others. So I'm deeply concerned about it. This is what autocrats and would-be autocrats do. They look to the most vulnerable and try to dehumanize them. And it also, I think, is a signal of other rights they want to take away from Americans. They've taken away or tried to reproductive freedom through this multi-decade effort at the Supreme Court. And they may target other rights and freedoms of other Americans, particularly vulnerable ones.
You know, Senator Bernie Sanders recently in an interview, I don't remember which one, had a sort of very interesting, candid moment where he said, listen, based on how long he's been doing this and his age, am I going to get Medicare for all pass? No, but am I maybe going to continue doing things that get more people health care? Am I going to make incremental steps, sort of in a sense, channeling the idea of Ted Kennedy of incrementalism and taking steps forward? As you now are running for Senate, and it's an interesting race, which we will talk about, How do you balance the idea of what you would do if it were simply up to you and the reality of partisan gridlock, needing 60 votes in the Senate to accomplish so many different things, the reality that the moneyed right is still extraordinarily effective at using fundraising and lobbying to prevent progress from being made? How do you balance what you would do if it was just up to you and the reality of what can be accomplished in a 6-year term?
Well, I also support Medicare for all, but I'm a big believer that you make progress where you can make progress. And, at the end of the day, you can't be progressive if you're not willing to make progress. I'm enormously proud of what we did in the Affordable Care Act, which brought healthcare to tens of millions of people that didn't have it otherwise. I do think, and I was a vocal advocate at the time, it was a huge missed opportunity not to pass a public option when we passed the Affordable Care Act. That would have been, I think, the most substantial downward driver of cost of anything we were doing at the time, and would have forced not only more reasonable costs for healthcare, but it would have given us a model, a Medicare for all model to build on. So that was a terrible missed opportunity nonetheless, but I have not passed the Affordable Care Act because we didn't do that. No, I'm glad I supported the final product, even if it wasn't exactly what I wanted, because it has done so much good. And I think we are moving inexorably towards universal care. We just need to keep the fire lit, keep pushing to get there quicker. And I'm still hopeful we will do it in Bernie Sanders' lifetime, let alone my own. But I don't think we let the enemy be or the good be the enemy of the perfect be the enemy of the good, excuse me.
When it comes to speaking of age, there's this interesting dynamic that's developed over in the Republican presidential primary where Nikki Haley announced that she's running. And when she's been asked numerous times, why would someone vote for you instead of Trump? Sometimes she's visibly confused. And when she's able to put together an answer, it's usually about identity. Despite claiming to be against identity politics, she's put together, well, I'm younger, I'm a woman, and I'm of a minority background, of Indian background. In your Senate race, the outgoing Senator Dianne Feinstein is around 90 years old. You're running early 60s, Katie Porter's 49, Barbara Lee 76 years old. How important to you do you think this idea of Democrats needing a new generation in power, how important do you think that is?
I think it really depends entirely on the person. So many young people are enthusiastic supporters of Bernie Sanders, not because of his age, but because a lot of his ideas are new and his ideas appeal to young people. That to me, I think is more important than what the age of the person is. That is, what are they advocating? What's their ability to get things done? And so people often make that synonymous with age, but it's not always the case. And I think, Joe Biden has been able to achieve great things for the country, including one of the most aggressive attacks on climate change in our history. You might not expect that from a president of his age, but nonetheless, he has been, I think, very effective and very progressive at the same time. Voters are going to consider these factors. Voters are going to look at age. They're going to look at gender. They're going to look at race. They should look at all of these things. They're also going to look at who can deliver for California, who's going to get things done, who's going to improve the quality of my life, who's going to help make sure I can live in a good neighborhood with good public schools, that my kids will be able to afford higher education, won't be saddled with debt, who is going to make sure we can drink the water and breathe the air. At the end of the day, they're looking for people who will deliver for California. And I think they will look for that regardless of age. I think they will look at who's got the track record of getting things done.
When it comes to something like tax policy, to pick something extremely both substantive and concrete, there's the very general idea of the rich should pay more. On the right, you have ideas from flat taxes to cutting taxes for the rich, all sorts of different ideas. Right now, we have a system where the highest tax bracket federally, 37%, around $500,000 in income. I know that's not exact. I don't remember if it's 460 or 520 this year or exactly where it is. In your ideal tax program, how much higher than 37 do you go, if at all? And where would those higher tax brackets start? And one of the things I find is whenever I ask elected officials this, rarely do I get numbers as answers.
Yeah. Well, and I don't want to disappoint you because I don't have a target number either. So I
Okay.
will list. But a big part of why I'm running is to make the economy work for everyone in a way that is just not working right now. And a big chunk of that is the tax code. When I was a kid, my father was a salesman. He made $18,000 a year. He bought a house for our family, he and my mother, that cost $18,000. You can't do that now, and not all of it is the as my Republican colleagues would like to believe, the product of some kind of impersonal market forces or Adam Smith's invisible hand. A lot of the reason why the economy isn't working is the product of a very visible hand of a very powerful lobbyist or a very powerful corporate interest. In terms of the tax code, when we more than doubled, for example, the child tax credit,
Yeah.
that lifted 40% of the kids out of poverty. And when that was allowed to lapse, millions fell back into poverty. That was a policy choice we made, and it's a terrible policy choice. So I would begin in terms of reforming the tax code, more than doubling the child tax credit. I would begin by providing very generous tax subsidies for people trying to afford child care. So we have accessible, affordable child care. So more women in particular, but men too, can enter the job force because they can afford quality child care. I would do away with how we treat the carried interest of hedge fund managers who get a enormous tax break. They're some of the wealthiest people in the country, and they
Yeah.
get that break not because it makes sense, it doesn't, but because they have very powerful interests lobbying for them. So a lot of these changes would make the tax code far more progressive. In addition to how we treat the top line ratepayers.
Would you like to see a top rate that is higher than 37%?
I'm certainly open to that, so that we have a tax code that is more progressive. I just don't know that I can give you the ideal number,
Yeah.
but I think, and going beyond the tax code, there are innumerable ways that we can make the economy work better for people, where we can incentivize the construction of more housing that's affordable, where we can ease the debt that students are forced to live under, all of which I would put under the category of making the economy work for people again.
Let's talk about the cost of college a little bit since you mentioned that. So I'm trying to figure out. So my daughter is 8 months old. I started the 529, right? I'm pretending as though the world is normal and it's going to be the same in 18 years when it comes time for her to have the opportunity to go to college. But I'm also doing the math, and I know that for her to go to the same school that I or my girlfriend went to, if costs keep going up at the same rate that they have been over the last 20 years, it'll be about $205,000 per year for tuition when she is 18. It sounds like that can't possibly happen, like that something has to break in the next 17 and a half years, or not, right? I mean, if student lending continues to stay the way it is and people can just get loans, I mean, the numbers don't seem to make any sense.
They don't make any sense, and it's a tragedy the way we funded higher education essentially on the back of students. I can relate a bit. When I graduated from graduate school, my loans were at 9, 12, and 14% interest. And my loan payments were higher than my rent for about the next 10 years.
Right.
I went into the law where I could afford to pay them off, which most people don't have that luxury. And it obviously circumscribes what they can do with their careers, whether they can follow their passion. It's just a terrible way to fund education. And I do think we need a complete restructuring so that we don't, put on the backs of students the obligation to pay for higher education this way. It is unsustainable, and sadly, this should have been done years ago, so that the people that have the debt now didn't have to incur it. And we cannot have a situation where your kids are going to have to pay $200K a year. That's just going to mean higher ed is only available to the wealthiest Americans. So we need to change how we fund it. We need to change the whole structure of it. We ought to, I think, begin by forgiving student debt. And we certainly shouldn't be forcing students to pay the government interest on their student loans. The federal government shouldn't be earning any kind of revenue or profit from that.
Couple other things in the limited time we have. From a political strategy perspective, I'm curious, there's this discussion now about the Republican primary for 24 and what it will mean in a trickle-down sense, including for races like yours and in the House of Representatives and others. There is one feeling that if someone like Ron DeSantis were to run, that he would be, if he became the president, significantly more dangerous than Donald Trump, in that he is more committed, less distractible, and potentially more effective at doing really dangerous authoritarian things. And so in some sense, the country would be better off with Donald Trump as the nominee, because he would not only be more beatable, if he was president, he would accomplish fewer dangerous things. And when it comes to races like yours, his presence on the ticket may inspire more turnout and help progressives and Democrats across the country. Do you have a view on the strategic aspect of what happens in that Republican primary?
I do, and I would put myself squarely, I guess, in the opposite camp. I know many Democrats feel like they would like, even aside from who became president, they would like Trump as the nominee because they believe he'd be easier to beat.
Yes.
He might be easier to beat than Ron DeSantis, but the danger of his presidency, of a second president, to me, is such a horrible prospect that I don't even endure the possibility. Now, not that I have any say in who becomes a Republican nominee, but I would rather have the tougher person to beat than even the prospect that Donald Trump could be successful in a general election. I do think that he is, although he's not as bright as DeSantis, he is a uniquely talented grifter.
Yes. Uniquely
Dangerous and shrewd divider of peoples. And so I think he would just tear the country apart. DeSantis would be a different kind of horror show. But to me, Trump learned from the first 4 years. And, he started out with a couple people of stature, like Secretary Mattis, and consecutively got rid of anyone who had any independent gravitas to stand up to him.
Right.
And put in place increasingly sycophantic people. He would start out with the worst of the worst if he got another term. And one thing we did see with him is that each abuse of presidential power was followed by an even worse one, culminating in insurrection. So to me, anything is preferable to that.
When he started saying your head is like a watermelon, were you hoping he would pick a different fruit or vegetable? Although watermelon is it's delicious, but what's your reaction to that?
Well, my reaction was, he went from calling me a pencil neck to a watermelon head. And let me just say, a watermelon head on a pencil neck is a pretty tough balance.
Yes, it is.
But my predominant thought on the various nicknames was, I thought he was better at it than that. The whole, cardinal rule of nicknames is you pick one and you stick to it.
Yes.
And he's had about 8 of them for me over the years. And so I don't think they've been as effective as they could be if he just stuck to one.
It is interesting that he always puts a caveat when he mentions you that you're a bright guy. Do you have any insight as to why he kind of mentions that every single time?
It is interesting. When I met him in the Oval Office during the whole Devin Nunes midnight run thing,
yep,
he came out from behind the Resolute desk where I have to say, it looked like the cover of Mad Magazine to me. He definitely did not belong in that picture. He comes out from behind the desk. The first thing he does when he shakes my hand is says, you do a really good job. Presumably he means on TV.
Oh,
that I understood, because that's what impresses him, how you do on TV. But I tell you, it was pretty awkward, because when somebody says something like that to you, you do a really good job. The first human impulse is to want to say, well, so do you. But there was no way I could bring myself to saying that. So it was quite an awkward pause after that comment.
That's a thank you, sir moment, and it would become one of his sir anecdotes that he's known for. Democratic Congressman Adam Schiff is running in California for the Senate seat being vacated by longtime Senator Dianne Feinstein. I know you're busy. I really appreciate your time and your insights today.
Great to be with you. Thanks for having me on.